Now, the first 6-week phase of the Gaza ceasefire is ending. Hamas has released dozens of hostages in exchange for Israel setting free hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Fighting should remain suspended during negotiations in Cairo for the second stage.
The ruins of northern Gaza. Palestinians returning to their destroyed homes, hoping the ceasefire holds. The 6 weeks of the ceasefire have been rocky, with Israel and Hamas accusing each other of multiple violations. But the next phase is likely to be even harder. The outlines of a second 42-day phase have been in place since last year. The deal foresees a permanent end to the fighting and a complete Israeli military withdrawal from Gaza. Hamas would release around 60 Israeli hostages or their remains. Israel would release more Palestinian prisoners. Talks on the future government of Gaza are also supposed to begin. But the details are complicated. Negotiators were supposed to iron out differences during Phase 1, but spent much of their time dealing with crises. A major sticking point is the so-called Philadelphia corridor on the Gaza side of the border with Egypt, near the city of Rafah. Israel took it over during its war in Gaza and is scheduled to leave. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not yet publicly stated that he will follow through. He faces pressure from right-wing members of his cabinet to maintain a military presence in the corridor. But there's also widespread public pressure to bring back the rest of the hostages as soon as possible. Gazans face a bleak future no matter what. Talks about reconstruction are only meant to start after the second phase of the ceasefire is over, when and if that happens.
Well, for more, let's bring in Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Great to have you on the show. So, Phase 1 of the truce expires today. So, why is Israel pushing for its extension?
I really want to go to Stage 2 for your viewers. Stage 2 of the ceasefire means turning the temporary ceasefire into a permanent end of the war. It means that Hamas will release all Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinians, prisoners and captives. It means Israel will have to pull out all its military forces from Gaza. And of course, the Israeli Prime Minister will never pull out all Israeli forces from Gaza, will never basically accept Hamas to remain in Gaza. He wants absolute victory. And the second stage of the ceasefire would mean an absolute defeat for the Prime Minister as opposed to an absolute victory, because neither the hostages, the Israeli hostages, will return home except by talks with Hamas, and Hamas will remain a political and military force in Gaza.
All right, let's actually talk about Netanyahu, because, of course, he is facing great pressure. First, he has to deal with his cabinet, who are pushing to end the truce. But then, of course, there's this anger on the street demanding the return of all the hostages. How do you see that going?
Absolutely correct that Benjamin Netanyahu is pressed between a rock, that is the pressure by the families of the hostages, their beloved one, and the Israeli public in general, and the hard place. He wants an absolute victory. He wants to go down in history as the leader who defeated Hamas and defeated Hamas utterly. I think the pendulum could easily basically shift to resumption of the war, because the pressure from the far-right coalition, basically they threaten Netanyahu. If he ends the war, they pull out of the coalition, and it would mean the end of his political future. And also, I think the reason why I am skeptical that Israel will accept going to Phase 2, because I think the Prime Minister has a green light, almost a green light, probably a yellow light from President Trump, basically to do whatever he wants fit in Gaza in the next few days and next few weeks.
Now, negotiators from the United States, Egypt and Qatar are actually holding those talks that we mentioned before in Cairo, aiming to get to this next phase. But where's Hamas, and can they actually still be brought to the table?
Point of qualification here. There has never been discussion about the second phase. Please, for your own viewers. What Israel and the United States are talking about is the extension, the likelihood of extension of phase one. Because what Benjamin Netanyahu and the Americans, to a large extent, they want to extend phase one. They want to get as many hostages back as possible from Hamas without really ending the war in Gaza, without Israeli forces pulling out from Gaza. Hamas has made it very clear. It won't basically extend the peace talks in phase one. It wants to go to stage two, because from Hamas' point of view, it wants an end to the war. It wants a comprehensive settlement because it wants to ensure its political survival in Gaza. So the divide is very huge between the Israeli government, the Netanyahu-led government, that does not really want an end to the war, and between Hamas, that basically wants an end to the war and release of the Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners. So you can imagine, without real American pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't think we're going to go to phase two, unfortunately. And I do hope I am wrong on this point.
Thanks. We'll have to leave it there. Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Thanks for joining us on DW News today.
I'm pleased now to welcome Daniel Gerlach to the studio. He's a Middle East expert and chief editor of Zenith magazine. Welcome, Daniel, to DW. Phase one of the truce expires today, and Israel wants it extended. Why is that?
Well, Israel has demands with regard to the hostages, of course, and Israel also wants to rephrase the language of the agreement. And it seems that the Americans have signaled that they are not completely against this, which causes a lot of irritation on the side of the negotiators, namely the Egyptians and the Qataris. There are different interpretations why Israel wants to extend this. I think the most plausible one is that Israel tries to delay the moment when it has to withdraw its military forces from the Gaza Strip as long as possible. And that's what's stipulated in the agreement under phase two. So whereas it's not entirely clear what phase two contains, because the more you look into the future, the less concrete the agreement is. But it seems that Israel wants to keep its forces there. And it said it again a few days ago. Government representatives have said they want to keep their forces in the buffer zone in the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, which is, of course, not in line with the agreement. And the only way to do that would be to continue phase one. That's why the negotiators say they don't agree with that, because they think that Hamas would also would not agree with it. And the negotiations have taken such a long time, and it's been such hard work for the mediators that they, of course, don't want to open it up.
Well, that brings me to the next question. All the negotiators from those key players, the key countries, Israel, U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, met on Friday in Cairo, but Hamas was not present. What will it take to bring them back?
Well, it seems that Hamas so far has complied with what its mediators, its negotiators have told the Qataris and the Egyptians. At least that's the position of the Qataris. They say that they can speak on behalf of Hamas. And they have a lot of doubt about the Israeli position on that, because they say Israel is trying to convince the Americans not to go with the agreement. It is quite plausible that Hamas would not agree with this, because for Hamas, of course, this is an existential situation. Now, look, the major problem I see here is the fact that it took so long for this agreement, and the fact that Hamas is still there causes a lot of distress on the Israeli side, because the Israeli public would also put Netanyahu under pressure, seeing Hamas fighters with heavy weapons parading on the streets of Khan Yunis, whereas everyone in Israel says we have killed 45,000 Palestinians, and Hamas is still there.
Exactly.
Now, on the other hand, you have the Arabs who are divided a bit, though they are in one camp. They say we want to negotiate this deal and we want to be guarantors of the deal. But of course, also on the Arab side, it's not clear what role they see for Hamas in the future, because phase two and ultimately phase three also, of course, contain provisions about the political future, the administration of Gaza. And there is division within the Arab camp if Hamas should be part of that or not. Phase three ultimately says that Hamas should completely disarm, and Hamas has complied with that. But on the other hand, it demands not only a withdrawal of Israeli forces, but also an end of the blockade of the Gaza Strip. So that's a very long-term game at the moment, and we don't have clear indicators what the short-term solutions are for the Arabs, let alone for the Palestinian side is.
And in the meantime, there's all this distress in Israel, as you just alluded to. Netanyahu is under pressure. Is it more so from the hawks in his government who want to end this truce, or the protesters on the streets who want to make sure that all the hostages are returned from Gaza?
Well, of course, he has reiterated again, he wants to use the extension of phase one to have the release of more hostages, of which, if I'm not mistaken, they believe that 56 Israeli hostages are still held in captivity in Gaza. Netanyahu wouldn't care much about the pressure from the protesters or from the hostage families. He hasn't done that in the past. The right-wing coalition partners are much more relevant for him. But here we see another scenario developing, which is the military operation in the West Bank.
Daniel, I have to stop it there. So unfortunate. I could talk to you all day. That's Daniel Gerlach, chief editor of Zenith magazine. Many, many thanks.